You're really going to
Okay.
disappear?
Huh?
You're really going to turn your camera off?
Yes, I am in a minute. But first, I'm going to introduce you. So I would like to welcome everybody who is potentially calling in and I can't see you, or people that are going to log in online in a minute, or the people here in the room with me, or the people who will watch later on YouTube. Welcome you to this exciting presentation and discussion titled Clinicians at the Intersection. It is part of our Social Justice Advocacy Week at the Chicago campus of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, where I work. My name is Ashley Ray, and I work in our Center for Multicultural and Diversity Studies. And I am excited to be able to host Jasmine Banks. She is a licensed mental health professional in Arkansas, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more about that. But I got to know Jasmine first through social media. We were actually just trying to remember what was it specifically. It was probably Twitter, because that's where all great relationships start. But we met on social media, and I think we first probably connected around topics related to racial justice, and then later on connected on mental health issues. And so Jasmine is a friend of mine and somebody that I consider a co-laborer and somebody that I admire and look to for guidance, and a friend. And I am really excited that we're able to offer her really critical perspective of the connections between mental health work and social justice work, and where those things overlap, how they are very much a part of each other, and how social justice work that may not appear on its face to be mental health related is still very much connected to mental health. So without much further ado, I am going to turn it over to Jasmine and let her tell you more about herself and talk about what we've asked her to talk about today.
Yay!
Thank you. Welcome, Jasmine.
So, Ash, did you assign me as a presenter so I can pull up my screen for folks?
I will do that right now.
Very shiny. All right. Can you see my screen there now?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. So, let me move this out of the way and we will get started. So the goal of the presentation is to really just start a conversation, as Ashley said, around developing a critical consciousness concerning our expert status. And as we begin to develop as clinicians in the academic and educational process, we often begin to shift into systems of power that we are often reticent to recognize. So I think it's a really important conversation for us to have, and we will get started. Let's see here. Oh, wait. Let me. Well, it's not doing what I wanted to do. Hold on. Hey, Ash, as folks come in, if they come in, how are we going to do the questions again? Do you mind reminding me?
You have the option to, you can just talk aloud about, does anybody have questions, and people can unmute themselves and ask out loud, or people could also put their questions into the chat box, and then we'll be able to see it light up. I think there's also a raise your hand feature on the chat.
Okay. So, as we said, we're talking about being clinicians in the intersection, and for many of us, the idea of intersectionality is new. We understand it from the movement language perspective, but we don't understand it in our personal lives, and so it often feels removed from us. So hopefully, one of the goals that we can have in this discussion, and I really would like it to be a discussion as much as we can, will be reframing and reassessing our analysis of how we're involved in our world. So first, let me introduce myself. So my name is Jasmine Banks, and I am a mental health professional in the state of Arkansas. I'm a licensed associate counselor, which means I'm still under my supervision process. However, I've graduated, I'm licensed, and I have my own private practice. In addition to the work I do with my private clients in the counseling setting. I'm also a program manager for postpartum progress, and I specialize in that organization in looking out for ways in which we can support at-risk communities in the intersection of mental health and reproductive health. So that is a little bit about my professional life. I decided, though, I should also tell you a little bit about my family because, it's important for you to know the bias and context from where I come from. So this is my oldest son, Isaiah, and he is just so precious. And he was a complete accident. I did not think I could have children, and he happened. Then there's Addison, my daughter, who is just full of joy and is just a powerful Black girl. She's amazing. And then my baby, Tobias. I play roller derby. That's an interesting fact about me. I'm in love with my dogs. I think they're better than your dogs and probably cooler than your kids. And then that's just my whole family. So I started getting involved in social justice work, I think, as a result of just being a Black woman in the world. I don't think that you can be a Black femme, queer person, and not be political. I think the very existence of who I am in the world makes me a political being. And so I started reading and writing and researching activism, and as a part of becoming an activist, I also started to see ways in which mental illness and mental health was played out in systems of oppression and harm. And so I started asking myself about what was I doing as a clinician to build the world that I want my clients to go out to and experience recovery in. Because I think that as mental health professionals, we have to understand that our agency and how we define self is such a complex process, and that we have a lot of perception about being experts who are removed, who help people who come into our safe sanctuaries and the spaces that we create for them to process and self-evaluate, and then we send them out into this world that is incredibly harmful, that perpetuates violence against them daily and stands in the way of the work they do in the spaces that we provide for them. So the objectives of this conversation is about really checking our self-perception, again, as it relates to developing this new critical consciousness and evaluation of how we show up in the world as professionals, developing our through lines between activism and advocacy, and then, of course, living in the world we are imagining, which is a really, really important part of the work that I believe we should be doing as mental health professionals. So when we're talking about how to shift our consciousness around activism and being mental health professionals, we have to recognize that there is this division between us and lay people, or us and our communities and the people that we identify as our clients. And it's been developed in hierarchical structure where there's expert power and we tend to be over people. Even if our theoretical approach is collaborative, even if it's person-centered, we still tend to hold a lot of power because of our license, because of our diplomas and credentialing. And so I think the first steps in moving how we see ourselves means shifting the lens to less hierarchy and more collaboration as an activist and advocate. When our clients come into us, instead of being a place where the work they do is detached from the communities and the worlds they live in, it's important to recognize that we are almost speaking on their behalf in the community. And I think that is an important part of the paradigm shift that has to take place. So then the important question when we're evaluating our self-perception and checking our self-perception is, what is an expert? A lot of people don't understand that whenever we graduate and we get our diplomas and we put our licenses on the wall and we put our shields out for work, that we don't understand how we are viewed as an expert by lay folks or people in our community. So here it's important to understand that experts are people who have a deep understanding of information or phenomenon. For example, emotional phenomenon that happen around mental health and well-being. it's also important to understand that an expert has more of a functional application. So experts are people who don't just state the problem, right? They engage in functional repair and change. And then experts finally have the ability to be fluid and transform as their community, as language, as definitions begin to transform. And so in a way, being a mental health expert means being an advocate, because advocates are people who functionally go out and represent the needs of a community, right? So when we're, oh, I guess I should move that. Is that in the way? Sorry. So checking our self-perception. Often systems of privilege teach us that our credentials make us an expert, as we just discussed. And these same credentials serve as the roadblocks to connecting with communities we seek to serve. So doing the work without the communities we serve, having a seat at the table, is a continuation of harm. I added that quote in there because it's often easy for me to feel that I've been given some sort of power as a part of having a license, and instead of framing it as power and expert status or a hierarchy, I look to transform the way I see it and think of myself more as, again, an advocate, and the things that I do are in service of people. So as we're checking our self-perception, I think an important practice is to build self-awareness through our curiosity. And so just being curious about the ways in which our privilege and achievement have afforded us privileges and power or status. Being curious about the status as a mental health professional. What is it? How does it impact how we see authority? How does it impact how you see your authority or the authority of people in your community? Checking our self-perception is the same sort of work we're required to do in order to check our privilege. And so when we hear people say check your privilege, it's a really uncomfortable process, but it's necessary for us to recognize the ways in which we show up in spaces, particularly with vulnerable communities. The other part of building self-awareness is we have to imagine the kind of barriers that become roadblocks to the work that we're doing and we're seeking to do in our communities. So often it's our pride and it's our fear of vulnerability. And we don't want folks to find out that we are not 100% pinned up. Oftentimes it can also be the fear that is instilled in us in the academic realm around ethics in our board. People who are licensed clinical social workers and psychologists. I answer to the Arkansas Board of Counselors, and so it is really, really easy to act in fear. But we know that fear tends to create toxic environments where we cannot access the best parts of ourselves, and so leaning into that fear and being curious about the ways in which the system is we're socializing ourselves and internalizing messages of harm. So let me check in with everybody real quick. Ash, are you still there?
I am still there, and I have a comment that I'd like to make. Can I go ahead and do that now?
Yeah, go for it.
So it's very interesting what you're talking about. There's a paradigm called cultural humility that I often use. There's a short article published by APA about cultural humility, and it's along the lines of cultural competency, basically a way of looking at things and kind of use a framework to use to kind of guide your practice. But cultural humility actually is a response to the concepts and the framework of cultural competency. And cultural humility responds to what some people consider gaps in the cultural competency framework. And so, like the three main tenets of cultural humility are so much in line with everything that you're talking about. First is that lifelong self-reflection and self-work, and really being critically engaged in learning about yourself, your own biases, and all of that, as well as who you are, what's your identity, what are your shifting identities. And then really a focus on a reduction of power imbalances and not trying to have a relationship, or as often as you can, trying not to set yourself up as that expert or that person in power, and kind of looking at what does it do to the relationship when you try to take out some of those power imbalances and make things more equitable. And then and something that I'm sure you're going to get into, because I can see it on the screen right now, is just looking at advocacy as more than just a person-to-person thing, but looking at the systems and the communities and the institutions that we need to be working within for change, and not just advocating for our client, but our client is affected by their community and by so many other things. And so it's exciting to me to hear you talking about, even though I didn't plan exactly together what was going to be your talk, that you're talking about the things that we actually teach here. So that's really exciting to me.
That's great. Yeah, I think that oftentimes the culture of mental health professionals is one in which we do a ton of engaging in research and discovery and curiosity around pathology as it relates to systems, as it relates to the interpersonal relationship, all of those layered sorts of approaches. And so we do a lot of that work in graduate and postgraduate classes, and then we get our credentialing, and we become licensed and start our own practices, and often that's where folks stop. They think that they've crossed the finish line, and now they can go in and practice, and they take these cognitive behavioral theories or humanistic theories, however they decide to orient themselves theoretically, and they build these practices of years of collecting hours and deepening their licensing credentials and specialization. And I often feel that I see with my peers in particular is the curiosity and engagement around community stops, or it's treated as though the person who is a mental health professional is removed from that work and they become an outside observer. And I think when we remove ourselves from our community in such a way and we elevate ourselves above the struggle and lived experiences of the folks in our communities, well, then we disengage from that empathetic connection that made the work worthwhile in the first place. And so I understand that there are people who are probably not going to say that they're psychologists or therapists or counselors, or however they frame their mental health professional label. They're not going to be necessarily changing themselves to cop cars and protesting in the way that they think about traditional activism. But as you said, advocacy is more than just caring. It's about building a world in your community that is cohesive and consistent with a vision that you say that you promote for the well-being of your one-to-one client contact. So yeah, you are exactly on point.
We do have another comment here.
Oh, great.
Go ahead.
Well, it's also a little bit of a question. So in terms of checking privilege, obviously, even if you do come from a background that is typically seen as a lower on the privilege hierarchy, that you do obtain a certain amount of privilege when you're getting these degrees, when you're getting these professional certifications.
Yes.
What is the balance, and by being a person in those demographics who also has these certifications, you're kind of having to balance, when do I make known that I am a person who should be seen as an expert or at least knowledgeable, versus when do I need to pull back and be humble? Do you have any kind of advice or formula other than obviously don't pull rank when you're talking to a person who is in a position that is less privileged than you, but I feel like that is kind of a difficult balance to achieve between I am a person of color, I am a woman, I am in this position, and people do not see me as worthy of this and worthy of any kind of consideration, but I'm also a person who has this power here. How do you balance that? I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, so I think that the first step with recognizing, and this is the same with extrapolating any sort of privilege that we have, is being acutely aware of the ways in which it shapes your life through process of self-evaluation, curiosity, and deep radical honesty. When we're talking about scholarly or academic privilege, it's really important to note things like you can easily defend an argument and evaluate arguments from multiple sides. You can speak to special groups because you've been given this, sort of this clout and elevated social strata designation. You know, there are so many different levels, and so I think the first layer for you to make any kind of change in how you engage in those discussions is to be aware of those things. And the second thing is being committed to repair, because I can't give you a model in which you can draw from to always have the answer whenever you're having these interactions, because of course interpersonal interactions and interpersonal communication is so varied and diverse. So you being incredibly committed to repair and recognizing that when people call you out, if they do, or you find that you have engaged in some way that is in like this vector of harm, that you can take responsibility for it, you can make amends, and then you can absolutely do the work to repair. But I don't think that so I think that one thing that has always been important for me to remember is this phrase, which is actually like on my little board here, and I always tell myself that I am not doing anything revolutionary if the people that I seek to help don't have access to what I'm doing, right? So the posture that you can carry then is, if I'm seeking to help blank, whomever they are, is something about how I'm showing up in the world inhibiting their access to the work that I'm doing. And that is a way to always check your intentions and to be really mindful of the work you're doing. Are you doing it in service of those people, or are you doing it in service of your privilege and self-congratulatory advocacy and activism? Did that sort of answer your question?
Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
You know, this is Ashley. I do have a question about what you just said. Do you have any examples either of both doing that maybe the right way or the wrong way of, you know, you're working towards something and you discover, or someone lets you know that what you're working on, yeah, it sounds great and everything, but it's actually not even accessible by the people that you're saying you're doing it on the behalf of. Have you seen that? What does that look like, either, you know, when it goes the wrong way or when you've seen someone do it, you know, as a good example?
So I've seen folks try to engage in being an advocate and an ally, which I hate that word. I prefer, you know, co-conspirator, co-laborer, in the intersections of mental health, religion, and social justice. And when they were called out, and this usually, the layers here are, you know, if race is always an implication, of course, right? So it was a white cishet man who was called out, who was trying to organize a mental health rally for LGBTQIA folks, and he was just heavily leaning on the queer community to give him lists of people he should reach out to. And the community responded and said, hey, like, if you're going to do this, you're doing this work and you're calling yourself an advocate, you're going to get all the speaking points, right? Like, the news is going to report that you're the activist and advocate, but we've been doing all of this work, so you need to do the work yourself, or we need to lead it. And in that instance, of course, as we often see, he engaged in white fragility and, well, fine, I can't do anything right. And so that is an example of how it goes poorly. How it is improved is when a person admits that they were negligent because of the ways in which they've been socialized to not see certain things, and then they create a counter strategy in mind, and they own their white anxiety, or their the privilege around their academic anxiety, which sort of seems like a misnomer in of itself. And so I haven't actually seen it play out in a way where it wasn't messy. And I think that's the point, right? Because community and doing the work, we get the praxis and analysis right in the context of being messy with one another. Like the revolution and improvement of our communities happens through really, really human connections. And so I would say even just the process of being called out and being uncomfortable is a win, because it helps us open ourselves up to a deeper sense of knowing and seeing each other, which is antithetical to the systems of harm and how they socialize us, right? They silo us off, they keep us from full contact in our humanity with one another, and they strip us of dignity. But it's incredibly dignified to openly say, I made a mistake and I don't know what I'm doing. And then, after you've done that, joining in collaboration is, I think, the point of transformation. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of really great examples of people who got it right. But I have plenty of those who got it wrong. Did that answer your question, Ash?
It did, and that last bit that you said about, just like the fear of looking unprofessional, or being able to admit, I don't know, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Like that, just in this academic environment, in this environment where we're, at our school specifically, we're training people to be professionals, not just researchers, but people out there working with organizations, working with people, working with, just the day-to-day realities of organizational change or mental health.
Mm-hmm.
We're supposed to, we're taught that we must be the expert and that we must be the professional, and that by living up to the expectations of others looks like always having the right answer.
Mm-hmm. And when we do the hard work of digging deep and deconstructing the idea of expert, we really become open about definitions around expert status. Many of us are saying we're experts and we're not behaving like experts. Because I said earlier, part of the characteristic of an expert is they aren't just passive observers. They don't just state the problem, right? They have functional application, and then they have the ability to be fluid and change as, whatever niche that they're in changes. And to have a deep understanding of a phenomenon or information, we have to constantly be plugged into the places where the phenomenon takes place, right? So if I'm saying that I'm an expert in maternal mental health, and I had kids 16 years ago, and that was when I stopped engaging in the maternal mental health community, and I'm not meeting with pregnancy, support groups, and I'm not checking out how pregnancy and motherhood or even birth is being redefined, then I fall behind. And what I've allowed myself to do is allow a system to convince me that because I had a certain level of achievement in one, moment in space and time, then I'm done, and I get to use that power in hierarchy. But again, we are doing nothing revolutionary if those that we are seeking to help don't have access to the work we're doing, which is a really good way to segue into the through lines of activism and advocacy. One thing that I'm always telling my clients, and I remind myself often, is that we can't truly advocate for that which we do not believe has value. Simply put, we take care of the things we like and care about, right? And if we take care of the things we like and care about, we can follow our focus and we can see what we really honor and value. So the first question is, how does your client experience re-injury when they leave your session? So whenever people ask me, Jasmine, how did you decide that racial justice was a part of the intersection of the work that you do as a mental health professional, I asked myself, whenever I see my client, let's say I have a client, it's a millennial client, it's a cisgendered woman, it is a black woman in Arkansas, if I'm imagining her recovery and I'm imagining her developing a sense of well-being. And then I send her out into the world. What are the things that could happen to her in the course of a day, just a typical day, that might re-injure her, that might ignite her fight or flight reflex and have like an amygdala hijack situation, and she's back in my office a couple of weeks feeling symptoms of panic and maybe some obsessive compulsive behaviors and incredibly self-harm talk, incredibly prevalent self-harm talk. So what do those scenarios look like? And when I really parsed out those scenarios, I recognized that racial injustice and the inequities that happen as a result of white supremacy and anti-blackness were the things that were injuring my clients. And so I had these clients who were paying me so much money to find a sense of wellness, and I was sending them out into the world. So when you, as a professional, are trying to determine the ways in which you can become an advocate or an activist, you can ask yourself this question, and it helps you hone in on where you might be best served placing your energy. If your clients are clients who are folks with disabilities, and you're seeing that they go out into the world and they are engaging their communities and being re-injured emotionally, or maybe even sometimes physically and literally, because they're not getting access through wheelchair ramps or other, actual physical on-the-ground type things. Those are ways to kind of get yourself into thinking about the ways in which you can engage in this sort of work. The next question then becomes, what issues exist that keep your client from obtaining full recovery, which dovetails into what I was saying before. There are justice issues everywhere, and systems of harm, particularly patriarchy, white supremacy, and anti-black racism, along with capitalism, go to extreme lengths to socialize harm in every intersection of people's lives, folks' lives. And so knowing what issues that keep your clients from really finding a full sense of wellness and dignity will clue you in on where you can be in fights for justice. The last question that I always implore people to ask of themselves and to be curious about the answer and the information is, what ways can you utilize your privilege as an expert to increase access? This is something that a lot of people have in movement spaces have a lot of opinions on. They think that using privilege to dismantle privilege is not exactly the way to go about things. And I think that oftentimes we make perfect the enemy of good. And I think that as long as we have these systems that recognize us as the expert and elevate us in this hierarchical place, what we can do is redistribute our power as expert to increase access for those who need a seat at the table because they do not have the privilege and access that we have. The last part of this is about living inside the world we are imagining. And I love this phrase, and it stands as a reminder to me often that, and it just feeds in from that last point that I was making about privilege, is that oftentimes we talk about these things as philosophical, theoretical things, and we don't move into action and internalizing those beliefs through daily living. And so you can ask yourself, how does your practice engage in issues of justice? Do you live out the work? If you're seeing that your clients are being harmed by environmental issues because their water is being polluted in the area that you live, and they're not getting access to clean resources because of pollution, does your office recycle? Where are they buying their products? Are they dumping, harmful chemicals? And so it's just more about being consistent throughout all areas of your life. In your interpersonal relationships in your office, are you engaging in violence, interpersonal violence, through, perpetuating the systems of harm that we've all been socialized to? Or are you breaking it down and being open and communicative? Are you being collaborative in your leadership style? there's all kinds of really important questions that we have to ask ourselves, and then when we find the answers to those questions, we have to create strategies and plans to live out what we say we believe. To put it simply, it's about, not just speaking about it, but being about it, which is a huge challenge for us because it's not convenient and it's very difficult and messy. So one of the final questions, and a very important question, is what is our ethical obligation in being activists and advocates within our scope of power? Do we feel okay being clinicians who simply put these Band-Aids on our clients emotionally and then send them out into a world that re-injures them? For me, the answer was no. I could not do the work that I was doing every single day and send people out into systems that harmed them. It just didn't jive with my moral and ethical compass, and I felt like I had to do the work to educate myself. And while I know that not every person feels called to do activism and advocacy as intensely and as like the part-time job that I do, my unpaid part-time job, I think that it behooves us to really be curious about the impact of, the future of our work. Is it ethical for us to continue to treat people and take their money and essentially have pathological person, or excuse me, a person with pathological behavior after person come into our office and sit across from us and look for repair and wholeness and well-being when we know where we're sending them is just going to engage in harm again? I think that is a very difficult ethical question to ask. And I think people arrive at all sorts of different places. So that is the short and somewhat brief discussion on being a clinician in the intersection. And again, there are so many intersections to life. It might be trans justice, it might be sex workers justice, it might be all sorts of different things. But I think the first place that we start is recognizing our fear of vulnerability and how oftentimes we don't feel that we have been given permission to be activists or advocates, and we feel like a counterfeit. And I believe that is just a very covert way that systems of harm have socialized us to believe that we don't have power to impact change, but we do. So yeah, that is the discussion starter. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many nuanced layers to all of this. But again, the goal, as I stated in the beginning, and the point of this, starting this conversation, is about the beginning of developing a critical consciousness. And in order to develop a critical consciousness, we have to ask the question why a lot. We have to find ourselves vulnerable and really, really deeply curious a lot. And I think that is how any mental health professional should start the process of becoming an activist or an advocate.
Thank you. I have, yes, please more of that all the time. I have a couple questions for you, but I also want to, because of the questions that I have, I could keep you talking for a really long time. So yeah. I want to take a pause and let anybody else, either some of the folks that are in the room with me or folks who may be on the phone or online, to go ahead and ask a question. And then if we don't have anything, then I'll ask you a couple questions.
Okay. Sounds like a plan. And I will go back to pictures of my kids.
Okay.
Because they're so cute. Yes.
Well, here, I'll tell you my general question, and then if somebody else wants to ask a question, please do, and you can put the question on the back burner. So my question is, can you give maybe one example each of your work in the maternity mental health realm, and your work in racial justice, and what I'm wondering if you can talk about is really anything that you consider relevant to the things that you were talking about today. So whether it's a specific scenario that went down or a certain program that you're working with, or a certain application that you discovered, or wherever you want to go with it, but your mental health and your racial justice work.
Yeah. So they're not separate. I mean, they can be, but for the majority of the work that I do is not separate. So within postpartum progress, my commitment to racial justice personally informs my overall approach to the program. So we know that maternal mental health, and I want to recognize that using the word maternal is not fair. It's not just, because trans men also have mental health issues around childbirth. Unfortunately, our language is having a hard time catching up. So we use maternal very often. So referring to it as reproductive mental health is probably a little bit more of a neutral phrase. So reproductive mental health issues don't discriminate, right? Like everyone is susceptible to getting them. But systems that treat reproductive mental health discriminate. We know that 1 in 7 women folk or birthing individuals will experience a perinatal mood and anxiety disorder. And we think the number is much higher, but those are just the statistics we have currently. And within those statistics, when a black or brown person comes and is seeking mental health support around pre and postnatal birthing experiences, when they have mood disturbance, oftentimes those black and brown folks are not properly diagnosed for their mental health crisis. It's usually misdiagnosed as something else, or they are just part and parcel dismissed completely. And so what happens is that brown or black person goes home. They have a hard time taking good care of themselves, taking good care of their baby, and someone calls DHS, and a baby is removed from the home. And that black person is criminalized. And so the work that I'm doing within Postpartum Progress is, one, we have an initiative that I've developed called Mental Health in Color. And Mental Health in Color is designed to fund clinicians, particularly clinicians of color, who are committed or have a high population of brown and black folks within their client niches, and get them specialized training on perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, so that we have black mamas and black parents who are feeling comfortable going and getting mental health care with a culturally competent person who is not going to then criminalize them and further harm them in their most vulnerable state. And so we're doing mental health justice here, but we're also doing racial justice. Additionally, we know that white and upper and middle class women have a high rate of recovery from mental health issues, but their black and brown peers don't experience the kind of recovery that they experience. And whenever I looked at the health inequities, the research showed that it was because those white women had insurance, they had family support, they had multiple resources from doctors, they had a team of treatment, they had a birth nurse, they had a psychiatrist, they had a therapist, they had a massage therapist, they had all of these resources. And so the question was then, how do we correct this? How do we redistribute the power? And Postpartum Progress is now funneling resources from those same folks who are raising money for our organization, which has primarily been a white-centered organization, and we're redistributing it. We're saying, okay, well, how can we get our new mom checklists to WIC in area, or excuse me, WIC offices in areas that are predominantly Black and Latinx. So these are the ways in which I'm doing work in maternal mental health, and we've got so many more things that we're doing as far as looking out for populations. We also have all of our checklists that are now translated Tagalog. I don't know how to say it. Is that how you say it? Yeah, French Canadian. We have an African and Black diaspora checklist. So, you know, we recognize that when we are using instruments that have been developed primarily to take good care of white people, and we're using those instruments to diagnose or draw a correlation with brown and black folks, that we were missing those people. And so I redeveloped the checklist that we use to help connect folks who are struggling with mood issues to their primary care physicians or counselors or whomever is taking care of them, and to kind of like clue them in that, hey, I'm having some postpartum depression. I changed all of the language, and then we paid to have the checklist translated into other languages. We're currently working on Korean. We also released our Mandarin list today, I believe. So we believe that language justice is also a part of the work that we have to do in that intersection of mental health, because if you can't access it because the language doesn't make sense to you, it's not, there's nothing revolutionary about it, right? It's not helpful. So that's what I do in maternal mental health. And the other thing that I do was, in the wake of the November election, there was a deluge of folks who were brand new to understanding the ways in which systems of oppression have harmed all of us, and they just sort of woke up. And they came to me and my good friend Ghazal, who is an organizer in DC, and said, what do we do? How do we do this? And so we created a private group, and we are working on our nonprofit status, and we have been educating those folks and providing them with primers and language, and just learning how, and opportunities to learn how to engage in direct actions, how to be resistors and disruptors, and it has been really, really fantastic. I think we're almost at 500 members, and what we've been able to do is catalyze all of that energy and amplify all of the organizations in the movement for Black lives that have been doing the work all along. And so our intention is not to reinvent the wheel or create another organization, but to use all of that energy and social capital to support the work of organizations that have been doing it for years. So that's the other part of what I do. I just scream at white people on the internet. It's fine.
Yay, I do too.
Now if someone, like now if I could just find a grant that would fund it, then, because I only work 25 hours with postpartum progress, and the rest of my day is spent doing organizing and activism stuff, and I don't get paid for that.
Yeah.
It's a lot of labor.
You know, I just through like conferences, you know, you develop certain contacts and certain relationships, and that opens the door for more relationships and contacts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've been both heartened and disappointed by, heartened in meeting people who, meeting people through social justice contexts and finding out that they're helping professionals, that they are educators, mm-hmm. social workers, or counselors, or they work at a legal aid society or something like that, and being really excited to find these quote-unquote professionals doing the kind of, you know, direct action sort of stuff that you referred to. And then mm-hmm. I guess the disappointment at the same time that I feel is that it is a small group of people, you know, and just based on my anecdotal life, you know, and I think about all the many helping professionals that I know because of where I work, because we mm-hmm. train professionals, and knowing that it's really such a small percentage of these professionals that are out in the world that are engaging in direct action or using a social justice or equity consciousness in their work every day. And I'm just really excited about really anything that can kind of bring those two worlds together and help the folks that haven't dipped their toes in the water yet and that are scared of it and think it's wrong to do it and think it's against the rules and it's not what they've been trained to do, or that they don't have the capacity for it, and all these reasons why it's not good for them and won't work. And I'm really excited to, I guess, host you and just to have one more conversation out there, one more resource to let people know that, you know, this is important and that you can do it and it's essential, it must be done. So
absolutely.
very
And I think that we often forget that we can ask these really hard questions of ourselves. My contention is that if you're in any kind of profession that touches, the value and dignity of someone's life, like a teacher, like a therapist, like a social worker, like a pastor, that you have an ethical obligation to impact your community for the better. And when we know that these systems are running rampant and unchecked and they're harming folks, we have to act. It is unjust at that point to act. And so when you know better, you should be doing better.
Yeah.
So, yeah. My cat really wants to be a part of this conversation.
Hi, Jasmine's cat.
This is Bullet.
Hi, Bullet.
What were the other questions? Were there some?
I don't have any other questions.
Okay.
I'm not sure if there's anybody else on the line who wants to speak up.
Hey, thanks for doing this. This is a really important way to start conversations around this.
Yeah. Are there any sort of resources or websites or anything that you want to highlight, maybe give a shout out to? Oh, and I do see a chat question. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
All caps, thank you, with lots of exclamation points. That's how I feel.
Anything to shout out?
Yeah.
Is that what you asked? Yo, go to Movement for Black Lives and log in and get their newsletter and then support the work that they're doing. I think that their agenda and the way in which they are engaging in conversations about justice and working in coalition with multiple diverse organizations is exactly the sort of solution that we need. You can use postpartumprogress.org if you are interested in getting involved. We have we call them warrior moms because we're primarily women folk in that group, but we have warrior mom ambassadors who are basically being caseworkers in their communities where they're going to WIC and they're reaching out to people at churches and parent meetups and giving resources for people who might be experiencing perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. We also have Climb Leaders who are our fundraisers, and they are a brilliant bunch. And then we have 8 regional online support groups via Facebook. So if you have any clients or students or just folks who are having issues around their reproductive mental health, they can come and participate in these groups and get some really great support that is not always available in person. So that is what I would say. And then you can read my nonsense on my blog at justjasmineblog.com.
It's a great blog. I like it.
Yeah. It's an alright blog.
Well, I think that those are all the questions that I have for you. So
Okay.
I would just like to thank you again. And I'm going to be really excited to be able to share this video with lots of folks and
Cool.
also to invite you back as a speaker. Oh, and for everybody that's on the line, Jasmine is going to be co-presenting at the Chicago School's Cultural Impact Conference in March. To co-present
with Kelly Wickham-Hurst.
That's right. And I believe you're going to be looking at racial trauma in schools. Is that right?
Yeah, we are going to be, Kelly is an expert as it relates to education, and she is going to be discussing the implications of race in the classroom from top down, and particularly as it relates to K through 12. And I will be looping in the impact of racial trauma on those children and their brains, the developmental process, because we know through evidence and anecdotal evidence that when you experience racial trauma, you can create a scenario in which people experience a type of PTSD. So there's significant implications of harm for, racism and anti-blackness, and we can't have our kids who are most vulnerable and in their most formative states being made victim to racial trauma in these settings. And so Kelly and I are going to tell y'all to do better. Get right.
Excited. I'm excited. So that will be, I believe, Friday, March 17th here in Chicago. So if you're local or if you're able to travel, come on up and see Jasmine and Kelly, and otherwise just stay connected with us here at CMDS, and we can help connect you to Jasmine and her work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the presentation now. Bye.